In the previous video, you saw the earliest animals in the animal evolutionary tree, sponges and cnidarians. Next, we're going to talk about the Lophotrochozoans, which are several groups of simple animals that do not molt as they grow, starting with flatworms. And I encourage you to go back if you haven't just watched the previous video. Go back and review the trends in animal evolution, because I'm going to try to focus on those as we go. So flatworms are creatures with bilateral symmetry. So this is something new. The previous creatures that we've seen had radial symmetry. Flatworms have an actual right and left side. They have a front, or a head end. Cephalization is the term that we use for that. And in that head end, we actually have a brain and eyes, as well as a mouth. They are acoelomate, meaning they have no body cavity, so they're relatively simple in their body plan compared to the creatures that we'll see coming up that are true coelomates. But they do have all three germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. So they're starting to look like more sophisticated animals. One thing about them that's very simple, they have an incomplete digestive system. What that means is they don't have a mouth and an anus. They've got one opening that takes in food and excretes waste. So in addition to that being disgusting, as you imagine what life would be like if that's how you had to go through life, this shows a relative simplicity of the digestive system. They also are largely hermaphroditic, meaning that they possess both male and female sex organs and can fertilize themselves. So that's pretty simple. Okay. Despite this simplicity, here's a diagram of a flatworm called a planarian. This is a free-living flatworm that lives in soil. We can see some development of some body systems. A nervous system with a slightly enlarged front end that we call a brain. Obviously not a real well-developed, but starting to look like a nervous system. Pretty sophisticated excretory system, so they can secrete fluid and waste. And the reproductive tract we see here, both female and male, as we mentioned previously. So starting to see some sophistication in the way that flatworms are put together. The next group that we're talking about are mollusks. This is the group that includes things like snails and octopus. We'll see a few more examples coming up in a minute. Take a note of these are the first creatures that are true coelomates and have a complete digestive tract, meaning they've got a mouth end and an anus end. The typical body plan of a mollusk, these guys do tend to look quite a bit different from one another. If you're looking at an octopus versus a snail, for example, they all have three major body parts. Visceral mass, which is all the internal organs that are present. A foot, which is the muscular portion that allows movement, and then a mantle, which is a protective covering that often in many of these creatures secretes a shell. And then some of them have a radula, which is a combination of a tongue and teeth kind of. So we see here a typical body plan of a mollusk. I say typical, there really is no such thing as a typical mollusk, but we can see generally what we want to see here, which is cephalization. Here's the head end with a mouth, and zooming in here, that's what we mean by a radula. It's a tongue with some sharp edges that kind of act like teeth to grind up food. And then we can see the complete digestive tract. So from the mouth to the anus here, a continuous tube, but it's not only one opening. Here's a heart. It's a pretty simple heart. And actually the heart and the stomach kind of blend together and share some substances. So this is all visceral mass, and then the movement end, in this case this is a snail-like creature here, the foot is the muscle portion that allows it to move. So in this case, this foot is causing it probably to crawl along the bottom of the ocean, or along the bottom of fresh water, or maybe even on dry land. The mantle, the portion that covers the visceral mass, that's actually not the shell itself. It's this thin tissue that is kind of yellowish orange here. In this case, it's secreting a hard shell. So those are the three major parts that we would see in all mollusks: a mantle, a foot, and a visceral mass. Here are a couple of examples of mollusks: the gastropods, which literally means stomach heads. They are what we probably think of as snails and slugs. Snails have a shell, slugs generally don't. The cephalopods, octopi and squids. These are some of the smartest non-vertebrate animals on the planet. And the bivalves, things like clams and mussels, generally enclosed in at least one, usually two hard shells. Because they're enclosed in these heavy shells, these are non-motile filter feeders, whereas the other groups that we just saw can crawl or swim or otherwise move around pretty freely. These creatures still have a foot. I know we talked about the foot as a muscle that causes movement. In this case, they might not move the whole creature all that well, but they can close and open the two parts of the shell. So there's the foot is still causing movement. Okay, the last group in this section is the annelid, which is a segmented worm. Probably the example that leaps to your consciousness is the earthworm. Not the only example, leeches as well. These have added, in terms of the trends of evolution, segmentation. Okay, so they have a complete digestive tract. They are true coelomates, and they have pretty sophisticated body systems as well. You can see that in this diagram. You can see specialization and segmentation, meaning that parts of their body are starting to specialize in certain tasks. So I'm going to skip a few of the detailed slides that show a few other examples, just to keep on track for this video, to take you through the evolutionary tree. And now we get to the ecdysozoans, which are the creatures that molt while they grow, and that includes roundworms and arthropods. So I don't have a ton to say about roundworms. These are some creepy crawlies that are not segmented. Okay, some of these are human parasites. You've probably heard of elephantiasis. You might have heard of Ascaris, which is an intestinal roundworm. But many of these are free-living and non-parasitic, so they just are minding their own business, living in dirt. But they do molt as they grow. They are pseudocoelomates. They don't have a true coelom or a true body cavity. And they've developed some pretty sophisticated body systems. So a lot of their effort is spent on reproduction. They lay eggs like crazy. They're absolutely disgusting to read about when you start to think about the idea of these guys laying 25,000, sometimes even more eggs per day. They're really quite disgusting. But they are biologically starting to show some pretty sophisticated body planning and body systems. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about one of, if not the most diverse group of animals on the planet, most successful group of animals on the planet, which are the arthropods. We probably don't know even 10% of the species of arthropods on the planet. So where it says as many as 30 million species may exist of arthropods, we have no idea. We're just guessing. These guys show a couple of really intriguing and interesting traits that allow them to be successful, especially for living on land, although some of these arthropods live in water as well. Number one is they have jointed appendages. So this allows them to, among other things, walk. Some of them can fly, some of them have claws that can grasp. These jointed appendages create a lot of opportunities for movement. They have an exoskeleton, so they don't have an inner skeleton, but they do have a protective layer around them made of chitin. This is actually why they have to molt as they grow, because this exoskeleton is not very flexible, but it's very protective both against injury and against dehydration. They're segmented. They have a well-developed nervous system. Some of them have gills, some of them have lungs, so a number of different ways of exchanging oxygen. And then a really interesting one, these generally exhibit some degree of metamorphosis, which means that early on in their larval stage, the young arthropods live a different lifestyle than their adult counterparts. That doesn't seem like a big deal, but the evolutionary and biological advantage to metamorphosis is that the larvae and the adults are generally living and eating different foods, living in different places. They're not competing with one another. That allows arthropods to be extraordinarily successful because the kids and the adults don't have to share resources. Okay, just a couple of quick examples. We're going to talk much more about this in the lab, but here's the body plan of an arthropod. There's generally a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. In some species of arthropods, the head and the thorax are combined into one section. And then we see these jointed appendages. This is a crayfish, so we see some of the appendages for walking. We also see some pinchers, another advantage to having jointed appendages. Here we see the idea of metamorphosis. So we see that the larval stage of this butterfly is eating and living a very different lifestyle and eating very different food than the adult. So again, the idea there is not to have to compete for resources. And a quick review of the different types of arthropods out there. Crustaceans are one group of arthropods. Some of the more famous ones that we know about, pill bugs. You remember that from our first lab in general biology, I bet. Barnacles, shrimp, lobsters, crabs. These are largely marine arthropods. Arachnids, okay, like spiders and scorpions and ticks. Horseshoe crabs actually fall in this group rather than the crustaceans. Centipedes and millipedes are two different groups. Some people confuse these. Centipedes are very different than millipedes. The creature that you see here that I'm circling with the mouse is a centipede. They generally have longer legs. They move quite quickly, and they are almost always carnivorous, so they eat other insects. They're actually quite ferocious carnivores. Millipedes are the slower herbivorous creatures that have shorter legs, and they generally roll up in balls when they're threatened. So centipedes and millipedes, two separate groups of arthropods. Last group, the biggest group, are insects. So many different species of insects.